So now we're entering our time for our keynote, which is a fireside chat with Priya Parker. Priya is helping us take a deeper look at how anyone can create collective meaning in modern life, one gathering at a time. Krista Tippett, host of the podcast On Being, has called her the voice of what it means to gather in this world we inhabit now. She is a facilitator, strategic advisor, acclaimed author of The Art of Gathering, and the host of the New York Times podcast, Together Apart. Priya has spent 20 years helping leaders and communities have complicated conversations about community and identity and vision at moments of transition. She has spoken on the TED main stage, and her talks have been viewed over 3 million times. As we send the Co-Sheltering Conference 2024 into orbit for the fourth consecutive year, we thought there would be no one better to help set the tone than Priya Parker. We place a premium on community building for our conference, in the field, and in our day-to-day lives. We do our utmost to build belonging around a disputable purpose with tightness of fit. At this special gathering with the most special, like-minded guests, we want to take the first moments of this conference to remind us all of how we meet and why it matters, here at the Co-Sheltering Conference and in our work where we are convening gatherings of people in crisis. We are thrilled to welcome Priya to our virtual stage for this fireside chat. So welcome, Priya. It's an honor to have you here.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be with you all.
We've spent some time talking about, why Priya for our keynote. It makes perfect sense to us, but you are very busy and in demand, Priya. Can you tell us a little bit about why us? So out of all of the offers you get to speak, you said yes to us. Is there something particular or something about this particular gathering that spoke to you?
I am a conflict resolution facilitator for groups. And so much of my work around gathering is trying to debunk the idea that you have to have a fancy house or a fancy degree or come from a lineage of gathering to be able to make meaning with other people. And so much of gathering to me is about connection and meaning making for a purpose. And so when you all invited me to join, I was deeply curious about both your specific disputable purpose and, as an outsider, intrigued by the dyad of connection between pet or dog and person. And so I am always interested in seeing how people are thinking about embeddedness and connection and community and lines of conflict and controversy and competing interests. And so I was very interested to be in conversation with you and said yes.
Well, I'm thrilled and grateful for your curiosity. So thank you again for being here. So as you correctly identified, my dog is my home, and our gatherings sit at a very specific intersection with very specific people. Our goal and the goal of the people who gather with us is to increase access to shelter and housing for people experiencing homelessness with companion animals. So we're the part of the Venn diagram where the animal welfare and the homeless advocacy circles overlap. A lot of the world doesn't even know that these circles overlap at all. Sometimes this work seems hard and lonely and, dare I say, even small to other folks. But according to you, this specificity actually has power. Can you explain this to us? What does it mean to have a specific disputable purpose?
We are gathering all the time. We gather in our schools. We gather in our workplaces. We gather on the street to protest. We gather with our families. We gather with our families. We gather with our chosen kin. And maybe to step back a little bit to give you a little bit of context about me, I went on a journey 5 years ago, actually now 8 years ago, to understand when people gather in modern life, in all types of different contexts, who are the people who are creating transformative experiences for people? And where is that happening? And I interviewed over 100 different types of folks in all walks of life, from choir conductors in Harlem to rabbis to a coach of a World Cup hockey team who has to get 17 players who have spent their entire lives playing for their own countries. And this coach has 12 days to figure out how to create a new identity, Team Europe. What does he actually do? How do you actually learn, whatever your context is, how to create connection and meaning and a safe and brave group? And so much of what I saw again and again and again and again was that the people who were able to create transformative experiences in their schools, in their workplaces, in their communities, first knew what the purpose was. They didn't skip to think, oh, a homeless shelter has to look a certain way. Or they didn't think, oh, praise has to look a certain way. Or, oh, we have to wed in a certain way. Or, oh, we have to grieve in a certain way. They didn't have fixed lines in their head of what a gathering looks like. And every single time they started with purpose, which is, what is it that we're trying to do here? What is our desired outcome? And the second was they got sharper and sharper on what that purpose was. The purpose is often specific and disputable. Not everybody's going to agree with you. But basically, when you have a specific, disputable purpose, you have a thesis. You have a theory of change. And part of what I see or assume in your theory of change, your thesis, is that people need to be in community and communion as they begin to make the lives of their choosing, and that we sometimes are judgmental or don't understand their forms of community or communion. And so part of what I am interested in, what you all are doing, is when there's a specific disputable purpose, you actually can make decisions, right? You can argue your case. You can explain to people why separating a person from their companion animal is actually incredibly destructive in certain contexts. So when you have a thesis, when you have a vision, and when people understand it, you can more actively and accurately and imaginatively advocate for that and find solutions that are community enhancing and that are well-being enhancing.
Amazing. Thank you, Priya. I love it when I don't have to, or I minimally have to explain my dog is my home's outlook, and people can just, they can deduce, they can use their own reasoning and be like, this is why they gather. So thank you. I really appreciate that response. So here we are in our 4th year of a virtual gathering. The first co-sheltering conference was in 2021, when the world was still very much operating in online spaces because that's what felt safe. In 2024, it seems like the world is ready to be back in person, yet we've made the choice to keep this meeting virtual. You wrote The Art of Gathering well before a global pandemic hit, but here we are. And how has the pandemic changed how we gather? And also, what advice do you have for us as we gather online to stay engaged and build community virtually?
I mean, I wrote The Art of Gathering in 2018. It came out in May 2018. And for 2 years, I basically went around the country, and if I was successful after an hour, convinced people that the way we gather matters, right? The way we shape our classrooms, the way a teacher opens, the way we begin a meeting, the way we begin a conference, the way we end something, who we bring together, that is shaping our belief systems. It's shaping what we mark, what we value. And after an hour and being sort of red in the face, if I was lucky, people would be like, oh yeah, gathering. And then 2 years later, to everybody's shock, gathering was banned, right? Gathering, it was taken from us. It became illegal and it became dangerous. And part of what happened in that moment was that the things that my fellow facilitators and I and sociologists argue about, things like group size, right? What's the right size for a meeting? Is it 6 people or 12 people or 10 people? What creates intimacy? What creates connection? What creates a phenomenon, right? What's 1,000 people versus 100 people? All of a sudden entered into the mainstream kind of headlines, governors issuing edicts about whether or not you can gather for Thanksgiving, and whether it's 10 people or for, in California, there's a declaration. I don't know if you all remember this. There's a declaration that if you're gathering for Thanksgiving, you can only bring 10 people together, and you have to have 6 feet apart. And there was like 32 rules. But if you're gathering for a funeral, you could gather 30 people. And so this tweet went viral on Twitter, now, formerly at Twitter, that was like, we're getting a pet turkey on November 28th. On November 29th, we will be inviting you to its funeral. Right? It's like people were kind of like really, really getting into the main element about like who gets to decide how we meet, right? And part of what has happened over the last 3 years is we radically experimented, because we had to, about what it looks like to gather, to meet. So I define a gathering as any time 3 or more people come together for a purpose with a beginning, middle, and end. So a wedding, a funeral, a meeting, a town hall, anytime a group is coming together. And basically, when we couldn't gather in the ways we used to, we began to experiment. And one of the major ways many institutions began experimenting was on Zoom. How many of you, maybe you can pop into the chat, like how many of you over the last 3 years did something on Zoom that previously you would have never imagined doing? Right? Maybe you attended a wedding. Maybe you attended a funeral. Maybe you attended a choir practice, right? Maybe, and I'm seeing the hands. And so it actually, it's kind of mind-boggling what we can actually do together apart. And by the way, there was a global pandemic. In the 1500s, one of the most famous novels written by an Italian writer, I'm forgetting, is the Decathlon, I think it was called. It was about 8 friends who gathered together during a global pandemic, and the story that they told to get through it, right? Meaning like day after day, night after night, the meaning that they made. Basically, there was no internet, right? There was no other form of actually meaning and connection. And so what we've learned over the last 3 years, and it's also a skill, is that though we are not sitting in the same room, we can still create psychological togetherness, right? And it's kind of a miracle. And it's also a skill, right? These are skills you can learn. And so if you are running a meeting or hosting a spoken word session, right? I was fortunate enough to enter when Ree was doing spoken word. That is something that you are creating vibration, right? You are creating language, you're creating cadence, you're creating story, you're creating memory through the ethers. And the biggest thing in all types of virtual gatherings, if you're hosting them, the simplest, like if you remember one thing, is to practice over and over again over the course of the 60 minutes you have, call and response. I grew up in a number of different churches, one of them in the Black church, and call and response is basically this, maybe do a little heart or raise your hand if you've experienced this in some way or the other. It's like the minister's like, said, praise be. And then the rest of the church says, amen, right? It's a cadence. It's are you here? We are here. And virtually, when you don't actually have ways to embed call and response, you have no idea if people are hearing you, right? You have no idea if people are listening. And so it's a learnable skill. I'm happy to go deeper in this, but it is a learnable skill. But the deepest thing that you have to create when you're in a room and folks are there, it's physical, right? When you're on a Zoom or choose your favorite virtual element, the core skill is helping people feel like they're psychologically together. And one of the core ways to do that is through the chat box.
Yes, thank you. I think that's so valuable, and it's such a central thing that I and the rest of the steering committee think about as we put these conferences together, because I think it's so easy to jump onto Zoom and to have the conference running in the background and have your millions of tabs open and you're checking your email, you're putting together a presentation for something else, you're checking your phone. and to not really be present for what is happening. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about how we can engage people to make sure that we are actually together.
But,
So
a simple way, if you are running any type of experience, is in the first 5% to ask people, and sometimes you can rotate it. If you're a team that meets regularly, you can rotate the question. It's just simply find a relevant question that's appropriate to ask the group, that everyone would be interested in answering, and everyone would be interested in hearing other people's answers. So can we do an experiment, even though I can't see the chat?
oh, sure.
You're all ready for this? You want to workshop a second?
Yeah.
So I'm going to say that one more time. So if you want to create more psychological togetherness and get people really focused in a moment to also understand who's here, where is everybody, where are they coming in from? I'm going to do one experiment. One is, where are you taking this call or Zoom from? Just don't put it in yet, but I'm going to ask you to put it in the chat. Where are you taking this call from, comma, like which city or town, comma, which room, or if you're outside, where? So it could be San Diego, comma, parents' basement, comma, and what is one sound you can currently hear outside of this Zoom? What is one sound you can hear? Just pop it into the chat. So I might say Brooklyn, comma, kitchen, comma, rain. And I can't see the chat, but if you're facilitating or hosting a meeting, right? All of a sudden it's like, hey, how are you doing? I'm going to make this up. Hey, Barbara, so good to see you. Didn't realize you were traveling. Oh, wow, Steve, you must be visiting your mom, right? Oh, I see that Sheetal is in the offices today. Wow, didn't realize she was in there. So good to hear you. Wow, so many of you are hearing a dog barking outside, right? And all of a sudden people are realizing, oh, even though we know, right, these people are here, we're creating a visual image and context around like who is here and where are they? And like, oh yeah, these are my people. So in the chat now, I'm curious for you all, and this is like, we can crowdsource and then you can take this list of questions. If you were to pause, this is the 4th conference of My Dog is My Home. And if you were going to gather this community and you wanted them to answer one question in the chat that's relevant, interesting, not too long, what's a question you could ask this group that through answering, you would feel like you're creating shared context, shared meaning, reminding them of their purpose, or something that feels fun, but within scope. And I'm going to invite you to just practice, to pop it into the chat. And if I could see the chat, I would be reading it, but it could be everything from one question I love to ask groups that teams to work across cultures is, what's the first concert or musical experience you ever went to and who took you? Mm-hmm. Right? For a group like this, it could be, what are the, what's the name of your pet if you have one, and what's their most annoying quality, comma, and what's their best quality, right? You pop it into the chat. All of a sudden, there's so many ways just through this chat that allows to create psychological togetherness, context. And then, by the way, when you're in remote work, when you don't see your colleagues all the time, when you don't see your family all the time, but particularly with work context, and a situation comes up, which it always does, a crisis comes up, there's conflict. It's not just a nice to have, right? Studies show that when people speak once verbally in a group, they're more likely to speak again. But also, if I know, hey, wow, they also went to Sweet Honey in the Rock. Oh my gosh, whoa, they went to the same concert I went to, or they went to the same, their dog is also, a combination of the same dog mine is. Doesn't matter. I'm going to pick up the phone. I'm going to give them a call. I'm not going to assume the worst, right? I'm going to pick up the phone. We're going to sort this out. So part of when you're gathering, when you're creating remote work and meetings and problem solving, the first 5% again and again and again and again is an opportunity to build longer term connection, context, communal fabric, just one question at a time.
Amazing. Thank you. You're right. You can't see the chat, and it's great in here.
Will you read a few that you're seeing?
Sure.
An example of call and response, right? So one of the calls I put out a call, you all are responding, but part of the feedback loop is I can't see it, right? I saw you all hearting Ree, but Ree was also very vulnerably and courageously be like, you mind screenshotting that and get it back to me, right?
Yeah.
This is how we create feedback loops. And some of it's tech, right? How do we figure out the tech? It's not always obvious, particularly there's multiple needs around security and all that, but this is live learning. How do we do this? How do we do this? So I'd love to just, what are some of the questions that are coming in?
I love this one from Vanessa. What's the most fun place or trip you have taken your pet? Let's see here. Another good one. What's the first type of animal you ever owned, and what's your favorite memory with them?
Beautiful. And who asked that?
That was Sarah Friedel.
Awesome. And give me one more.
And let's see, I'm going to scroll up here. Weirdest thing your dog has ever eaten? I like that
These
one.
are awesome questions. Awesome questions. And let me, and just, again, this, when I say gathering is a learnable skill, you don't need a fancy house. You don't need a fancy degree. Like, it's the ability to create meaning and specificity around a shared purpose. These are awesome questions, right? What's the weirdest thing your dog ever ate? It's specific, right? It's context. It's going to make people laugh. It reminds people like, oh my gosh, like we all have these like shared experiences that we're harvesting. The question about what's your favorite memory, right? That again, depending on the size of the group, depending on how long you have, give people 30 seconds or a minute. That takes a second. It takes a second to write out. It may be a 100-word answer, and then if you're running the meeting, you take a moment to either say their name, right? Again, oh, Vanessa's here. Oh, Cheryl's here. Paula's here. Barry's here. Heidi's here, right? It's creating this web that's making the implicit explicit. And then you can read aloud, or you can, if you're going to even go further on this and be like, let's actually hear from two of these. Hey, Heidi, could you unmute and just tell us what happened when they, ate the couscous? Right? Heidi gets on and starts chanting. I was like, oh, these are my people. Oh my gosh, this is why we care about this. And then you start the meeting. Mm-hmm. Thanks, Heidi. You're on my Zoom, so I see your name.
Well, thank you, Priya. That was a super fun exercise. So as I mentioned before, we're now in our 4th year of gathering. The conference never fails to inspire, and I think we all ride very high when the conference is over, having made new friends, new goals, explored new ideas. But as we grow and get more established, I think conflict also shows itself more. So now that we know each other better as a community, there's also more conflict. On one hand, like, what a privileged place to be. We've been convening for long enough where we may be able to get past that honeymoon phase. On the other hand, conflict can be a really challenging aspect of gathering. And there's a lot of content in this conference that can stir strong emotions. We're talking about deep-seated values that people have, and hot-button social issues like poverty, housing, race, migration comes up heavily this year. It might all come wrapped up in the shape of a fuzzy kitten, but tensions can still run really high, sometimes even higher when it comes wrapped up in a fuzzy kitten. So how do we have relevant conversations that address conflicts without burning the house down?
This is an awesome question. And the deepest advice I have is to intentionally create a culture of healthy heat, to water the garden so that you normalize disagreement, you normalize having relevant conversations around controversial lines and maintain connection through it. So that it's not this thing that happens out there, or it's not this thing that, like, when it happens, it's a total crisis. We're actually normalizing and creating our own ability to be able to widen the space to actually talk about these deep-seated values. And let me give a couple of examples. The first is I was working with a manager years ago. She called me up and she said, my team is too positive. And I know there's problems, but they're so afraid of conflict that like nothing, we're not able to actually have the conversation. What do I do? And I said, Don't try to change the whole meeting. You have a staff meeting, right? Yep. Okay. So once a week, just focus on the first 5%. Focus changing the first 5%. You're all going to hear a theme here, which is openings matter. The openings create the world, even if that world is 45 minutes. And I said, start and do it relatively quickly and do it 10 weeks in a row. This is the watering the garden part. It's not just one time. It's not a trick. It's actually shifting the culture. And I said, I think it was a team of 10, take 10 minutes, no more, no less. Everyone zips around. Actually, you could do less, zips around and just says their rose and their thorn for the day. Sorry, for the week. And she said, great, I'm going to go do this. And she was, and you could talk about work, you could talk about home, you could talk whatever. And I said, do it for 10 weeks. Like, don't worry, just do it for 10 weeks. So, and then call me. So she called me back up 2 weeks later. I said, what happened? And she said, well, the first few weeks, people were not totally sure about it. Some people were gung-ho, some people were very timid, and they took different levels of risks. And that was okay. For some people, talking about work felt risky. For some people, talking about things outside of work felt risky. All was okay, all was welcome. But by week 5, week 6, everyone started expanding their aperture of what they were willing to say, just about their rose and their thorn. And did I say rose and thorn? Yes, rose and thorn. The best of your week, the worst of your week. So there's a rose and thorn. The worst part of your week, the best part of your week. It's a parenting technique and by week 5 and 6, they started sharing the expansion of what they were willing to talk about grew. But the second thing is the rest of the meeting began to change. Why? Because she normalized thorns. So there are ways to basically start practicing the habit. I'll give another example. I was speaking with a group of senior managers at a company, and they had a really big, major decision to make. But it wasn't 3 people, it was 750 leaders in a massive company. And they basically said from the get-go, the only thing that's going to impede us is our inability to actually talk about this thing and talk about what's the strategy. And it wasn't about identity from a race or migration. It was about identity from who are we as a company and what do we think of ourselves as being. And to warm them up, they did a 30-minute, the guy got up there, one of the heads got up there and he said, I know we're here together for 3 days, and I know we usually warm up to stuff together to get to the hard stuff, but it's a difficult moment. And we need to have some conversations I know we've really been avoiding. I was in the room and you could just see people kind of, like, ooh, here we go. And he said, in order to do that, we're going to actually start by asking you 4 really controversial questions. And you're going to get into groups of 4 and you're going to debate. And everyone kind of looked around and you could kind of feel the oxygen come out of the room. And then on the slide, it went up and it said, is a hot dog a sandwich? And people were like, what? And he started laughing. He was like, but I'm serious, go debate. And people started, turning their chair. And at first they're like, this is kind of dumb. And then immediately like, well, of course a hot dog is a sandwich. And someone else was like, no, it's not. No, a hot dog's not a sandwich. A sandwich closes. And someone else is like, what are you talking about? And, started going like sandwiches. And they started normalizing debate. Then the next slide went up. What is the right time for lunch? Right? What is the right time? What are you talking about? And he turned to the group and all of a sudden someone was like 11 a.m. And everyone else, 11 a.m. What do you like? That's like so early. And someone's like 1 p.m. Someone else is like, well, actually, I'm Indian and I live in Tamil Nadu as a global company. And I actually eat breakfast at 6:30. And then I eat breakfast at lunch at 10:30. And everyone's like, oh, there are cultural reasons people might have a different time, right? Basically, they normalized low stakes banter. And they practiced, they were building muscles to face each other, to have humor in it, to normalize so that they could actually then grow the stakes of their conversation. And so it's a really, really important skill, but to do 2 things. One is to build the skills to be able to collectively have conversations about the things that matter to us, particularly when there's lines of controversy. And the second is to stay connected and to imagine long-term connection with these colleagues in part so that you're able to say, I can both be really reacting to what is being said in the room. And I also know that we have a shared longer-term vision and I'm willing and committed to work through the discomfort.
Wow. Thank you. That really gives us a lot to think about. Thank you. so much of your work is around sort of expanding the tolerance level, I guess, of conflict. So
And
when
I'll say one more thing, which is, I often joke, I'm biracial, I'm bicultural. My mother's Indian, my father's white American, and I come on both sides from 3 generations of ostriches. Meaning, when conflict comes up, we just like to stick our head in the sand.
okay.
And my parents, they were married, for about a decade, and then they separated. And then they divorced. And within 3 years, they each remarried other people. And they remarried people who, in a lot of ways, were kind of reflect their original kind of communities. And they had joint custody. So I grew up for 8 years going back and forth between these 2 homes. And one was this Indian, British, Buddhist, progressive, atheist on some days, agnostic on others, vegetarian, incense-filled house. And then I would travel 1.4 miles and enter my father and stepmother's house and at home. And it was and still is a white American, evangelical Christian, conservative, Republican, twice a week, church going, meat eating, basketball playing, get the point, household. And my husband often jokes it doesn't take a shrink to explain how Priya got into the field of conflict resolution. And and so much of what I basically learned through that was that when my parents divorced, everyone was shocked because they never fought. And I grew up in a home, and it made me understand that human connection is as threatened by unhealthy peace as it is by unhealthy conflict. And I'm a conflict resolution facilitator who's conflict averse. And I think one of the reasons why I am effective at my job, or relatively effective, is because I have deep empathy for the people in the room who just want to flee. And I've somatically learned practices that allow me to stay in the room, that know that to this day, when the heat rises 20 years into my career, my palms get sweaty, right? My heart starts to palpitate. And I realize, like, oh, that's not danger. That's just what my body does. And so the last thing I'll just say is, as you think about your own conflict styles, it's shaped by culture, it's shaped by community, it's shaped by family of origin, to know, am I conflict seeking? Am I conflict averse? Am I a troublemaker? Am I a smoother rover? And whatever your back foot is, to know that, again, you can build tolerance. You can build, these are also learnable skills to be able to hold heat in the room, because you're only going to be able to hold the conversations as deep as you can hold heat.
Ah, my God. Yes. That's a killer line. Okay. Wow. Okay. Well, I want to give people an opportunity to ask questions of you, but I have one last question of my own for you. This gathering is a little bit meta. We're having a gathering about gathering. It may not seem like it at first, because people don't normally think about social services or animal services as gatherers, but we are. Service providers are convening people, and in many cases, animals also, but it's in crisis situations. So it's on somebody's worst day. Homeless shelters are places of gathering. Housing developments are places of gathering. Animal shelters are also places of gathering. And the service providers are the hosts. How do the principles of the art of gathering transfer to a gathering spurred by crisis?
They become even more relevant. They are art of gathering on turbo. And I love that you are framing service providers as hosts. I think that's absolutely true. And the role of a host is to practice what I call generous authority, which is using your power for the good of the group to help it achieve its purpose with care. And generous authority, when you're a host, and this is any type of gathering, and it's particularly true in moments of crisis, in moments of conflict, is you have 3 roles as a host. The first is to connect your guests to each other, to the purpose, to you, to help them feel safe, to help them feel like they belong to a place, to allow them to understand the context, to know what it means to be in a place and to be part of a place. The second is to protect your guests from each other. And that, whether it's in a context of a family Thanksgiving, right? An extended family Thanksgiving, and there's a belligerent uncle, right? And then actually not just allowing that to happen to shift the situation, whether that's getting, at a volunteer training and there's one person who just is taking over the entire group and asking every single question and no one else gets a word in edgewise. You're protecting your guests from each other. Or in a higher stakes context in crisis, what does it mean? Connection is one form of safety, but so is protection. Right. And so what does it actually mean? What is the role of protection in a context? And particularly when there's conflict, whether there's an incident between animals or between animals and people, whether there's those are actually the moments of friction where you have to think about what is our purpose? What is my intention? Where are our lines? And how do I do this with care? And then the final element, so connect, protect, and equalize, which is relatively, how do I make each person here feel whole? Feel as equal, again, given that they're willing and agreed to behave according to our principles and values. How do we enforce that? And people often think that gathering is about connection and love, and it can be, but it's also about power. Gathering is a line drawing, saying who is here, who is not here, who is in, who is out, what do we allow here, how do we protect, who needs to be exited, why, how do we do that? The core that people often say, what's conflict resolution to do with gathering? And I'm like, everything, right? Gathering around what, for whom, and who gets to be a part of it is the core of every gathering. And it's even more escalated in moments of crisis and conflict.
So can I ask you, I know I said that was my last question, but to tie it up with a bow before we go into Q&A for just a few minutes. And I'm very interested in what you have to say here because you're an expert on gathering, but not necessarily steeped in animal welfare work. So what do animals have to do with gathering, purpose, and belonging? Why does it matter to think about them if we want to create a sense of belonging for people in crisis?
Animals, the role of animals in gatherings is deeply culturally specific. And in some contexts and cultures, you would never have an animal in a sacred space. You would never have a dog in a house of worship in certain contexts. In other contexts, including in religious contexts, animals are woven through the thread of the stories. And so the first thing is, at some level, in any cultural context, the role of animals are often lines around taboo, right? How close, if you think sociologically, how close are animals things to be kept outside, or are they things to be kept inside? And you all are working on that line, and it is a disputable line. And how people feel about it is based on their own lived experiences with animals, how they've been treated by animals, whether or not they're scared of them as a child, whether or not they've been bit or not, what their own beliefs have been. You are cultural carriers on controversial lines. And I love what you said earlier around it's all wrapped up in a fuzzy kitten, because you think what could we be fighting about? And actually at the deepest level, to know that part of where the line that you're thinking about is this is contested space. Mm. And to know that you are to workers who, and I use that as small case W's, workers of care who have a specific thesis and either need to educate others on that, expand people's lived experiences on what you mean and why you think this is a source of connection and affirmation. And when we don't realize that we're working in contested space, we don't use the right tools. And so to me, it's actually a very important question, because in every culture, at some level, every community, every culture has different lines of taboo and who is in and who is out. And to know that you're working on one of those lines will help you.
Thank you. You're right. It's a contested space. And I think for us as people who are advocating for the co-sheltering, co-housing of people and pets together, it's better for us to embrace that the fact that this is contested space. Like, it's very easy to get frustrated at the fact that like other people just don't get it, right? Like that, they don't get it. What's the big deal about letting the fuzzy kitten in through the door? But to embrace that it's contested space and then to acknowledge that there will be conflict makes
And
us
to understand, like, as a conflict resolution facilitator, to understand, like, where and if there's like relevant need or relevant fear,
yes,
and seek to understand and design for it.
yes, yes. Well, thank you, Priya. I wish I could talk to you all day, but I am being selfish. I'm being selfish. We have time for just a few questions from the audience. This is the time to put your questions in the QA function on Whova. And so that is different from the chat box. Everyone migrate over to the QA box in Whova. And if you have a question for Priya, please drop it in there. I am monitoring that. But while people are putting those in there, I wish you could see the Whova chat, and I will gladly screenshot this for you and send it over to Aya. But people are very inspired. They love your message.
I'm so glad. And actually, while you're waiting, we have a guide that might be relevant for you all as you're navigating this line of like, what is the contested space? What is our purpose? How do we figure it out? And again, one gathering at a time. So not to make it too big. And I don't know if she has access to the chat, but if Katie, if you can drop in the new rules of the purpose worksheet. I think it's the first part of the new rules of gathering, but we have a digital course that teams are taking within their organizations called the Art of Gathering digital course. It's a 6-week virtual course to learn the skill, but particularly to learn the skill with cohorts and colleagues. And the most popular lesson that when we've had thousands and thousands, we just launched it a year ago right after a year ago, we're still pandemicking in some way. And the most popular worksheet is the one we're sharing with you. And it's basically when people say, okay, you've transformed, or like Art of Gathering has transformed how we deeply think about what we're doing and who we're hosting. It's this purpose worksheet. So we can drop that in, Katie, into the chat while people are waiting. It's a free resource. Welcome to download it. And my deepest suggestion is to do this with your colleagues, with your teams, so that you're normalizing the conversation around, well, what is the purpose? And are we agreed on this? And where are the lines? And what does it mean to be specific and disputable? So that you're already starting to, with your colleagues, figure out what, at some level, your approach should be.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And actually, to our team at Creative Allies, maybe we can share Priya's slide while we take the one question that we have from our audience. So I know, Priya, you have to go. So here's our one crowdsourced question that I've picked out for you. There are always so many meetings. How do we decide which gatherings we should keep and which ones we should scrap?
This is such a good question. The first step is to normalize that question. In your workplace, you can say, I saw this woman speak. Her name is Priya Parker. Blame me. And she said, and the biggest way to shift the culture of your organization or your workplace is to make what's the purpose of this meeting not a taboo question. Mm. And so a couple of things, sort of zooming out a little bit. We've talked a lot today about the host, but part of the Art of Gathering, it's called the Art of Gathering. It's not called the Art of Hosting, in part because guests have a lot of power. The way you guest, what you choose to attend, when you're on a Zoom, whether or not you're kind of, present, or whether folks can see you doing other stuff, it affects the room. It affects the Zoom. And so to practice what I call intentional guesting, which is, first of all, zooming all the way out, almost like the way you do a New Year's resolution. You can do this with your team. You can do this with your family, chosen or otherwise, which is, what are the cadence? How many meetings is healthy for us to have in a week? Right? It's like larger, or socially, like how many, if I get invited to things, what is my energy levels, and what is actually a healthy amount of things to go to? And then the second is to practice an enthusiastic yes. Can't wait for your meeting, Sanjay, right? I'm so excited that you're doing this, Doreen, right? Or to practice a connected no. don't ghost or be ambivalent, to say, thank you so much for inviting me. I love that you're hosting a birthday to celebrate whatever. I'm so sorry I can't make it, but thank you. You know, I hope to see you soon. Right. So it's like each moment is actually an opportunity for connection. I think also there's a newsletter. I have a monthly newsletter. The last one actually just went out this morning. But I have a newsletter around how to practice intentional guesting. I don't know if someone can Google that and pop it into the chat, but to start figuring out what to go to and what not to go to is to zoom all the way out. And then the second is to really ask, well, what is the purpose of each of these? Do we know what it is? And to normalize the conversation across your colleagues to say, you know what, maybe that email, maybe that meeting really could have been an email. And the last thing I'll say is the pandemic has normalized some of these questions, which is, I don't know if you all remember I think it was a New Yorker cartoon, March 2020, and it was like two Vikings, or, sort of like going to invade, a crusade. And one looks at the other and everything was being canceled. And one looks at the other and said, I guess that meeting really could have been an email. Right. and so that happened to a lot of us. And so really knowing that, I mean, we can end on this, the time we have together is sacred. And the highest real estate is getting people at the same time, at the same place, to talk about the same shared thing. And so to treat that as such, and to not assume that every problem, that the answer is to meet, is to gather. Sometimes, I advise organizations, I often say, I'm not saying gather more, I'm saying gather better. And sometimes gathering better means gathering less.
Yes. Well, thank you, Priya. There are some questions that I didn't get to in the Q&A and in the chat, but I want to thank you for being here with us. It has been an honor. And thank you for also sharing how we can continue to learn from you and follow your work on gathering. So everyone, snap a photo of this QR code and follow Priya Parker. So thank you again, Priya. It has been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you all. I can feel your energy. I thank you. Thank you, Christine, for relaying back the chat. And I hope that you all use that. You use the chat, and I'm gonna skedaddle, but maybe to close, I'm gonna invite you all to pop into the chat one insight you took from our time together today from this conversation, and look at it and then try it. Try one thing in the next week that allows you to practice that skill. Be well.
Thank you. You be well.
Bye.